paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Dave Collum. He is a professor of chemistry at Cornell University and the associate editor of the Journal of Organic Chemistry. How you doing today, Dave?
I'm good.
I've watched you on various podcasts, and you've impressed me with your knowledge of a lot of different things. And one of the things that you've talked about is digital totalitarianism. And I am an algorithm, therefore I am. What do you mean by that term, digital totalitarianism?
Well, I think it's actually a battle we have probably already lost, and that is that when the internet first showed up, it was cool, and then I realized that it was democracy's greatest hope and potentially worst enemy, and it changed the way the devious guys in the world handle the problem. So they used to do things and try to keep them quiet. Now they do things and they just have to. They try to bury you with bullshit, as they say, and so now we're having to wade through this debris field of misinformation, which they're always accusing us of doing, but in fact they're doing it. And I think we're losing. I think that the entire digital world is very much under control of the deep state, or the phrase that again, supposedly Dan Rhodes coined it, the blob. And I think we've lost in that sense. I think you no longer can trust what you read at all. I don't even know how to fact check something anymore. If there's rule of thumb, if you look up a topic and there's fact checkers all over the place, they are probably hiding something serious.
I'm often called a conspiracy theorist. And
you should be proud of that. You should be proud of that.
What's interesting, when we get into digital totalitarianism, it became really overt with COVID.
Mm-hmm.
If you mentioned that COVID escaped from the Wuhan lab, your posts were summarily discarded, taken down and discarded.
Or kicked right off Twitter, right?
Yeah, or kicked off Twitter. So now that we know, I mean, the government has even conceded that COVID could have escaped from the Wuhan lab. It's interesting to me that people still don't realize that because there was so much censorship early on about COVID.
Yeah. I'm reading a book right now, which took me 2 years to start. The author sent it to me, a guy named Fergus O'Connor, called 180. And he basically says everything you think you know, flip it 180 degrees and you'll have something closer to the truth. And it's a riveting book. It's 800 pages, so it took me 2 years to get started. My computer failure at my cabin actually said, okay, I guess I'm going to read 180 now. The lab leak, in my opinion, is itself a cover story, because as long as we're arguing whether it came out of the Wuhan lab or out of the meat market, we're ignoring the fact that we actually created it, probably in Fort Detrick, probably 15 years ago, with the help of guys like Ralph Barrick and Peter Daszak. And so I think that this virus has existed in its current form for many, many years. The vaccine was developed in parallel because that's what you do with bioweapons. I think it was undoubtedly a bioweapon. There is still a debate as to whether it was released intentionally. That's a good discussion point. And I had a military intelligence guy reach out to me and tell me he was in Wuhan at the military games when everyone started getting sick. And I've heard people say that that's some sort of cover story, but he took it very seriously, and I've gotten to know the guy. I've had lunch with him and stuff, so he's a serious player. But while we're talking about where it leaked from, we're ignoring the fact that we created it. We're ignoring the fact that there were 36 bioweapons labs in Ukraine. There's just a lot of stories that we're not talking about because we're talking about the lab leak.
What amazes me is the CDC was underwriting gain of function experiments at Wuhan lab, and nothing's ever come of that.
Yeah, and supposedly Obama kicked it out, but what I don't know, and I haven't heard anyone can provide convincing data, is did he kick it out or did he kick it offshore? And Fauci clearly kicked it offshore, but whether Fauci said get it out of the U.S., I don't know. I don't know how that worked, but Fauci is about as despicable a human being as you can get. I mean, he really has been a very bad person since the beginning of his adult career. He's been doing bad things. So
what I was struck by when those emails came out is just his utter cynicism about masks, how he was preaching that Americans had to wear masks, but in his private life, he was telling people, well, you don't really need to use masks. And that type of cynicism was very alarming to me.
Well, the other thing is that someone in Fauci's position should know that none of the masks that anyone was wearing are good for viruses. Right. So it's conceivable that when these N95 masks might work for a little while or might cut back. There was actually a study and it caused an 11% decrease. And as the guy Kuldorf said at Harvard said, I wouldn't be raving about an 11% decrease. But what was obvious was right from the get-go, the only thing they required was compliance, not efficacy. And so if they say, look, everyone's got to wear a mask, but you can wear a doily on your face, we don't care. That tells you the mask wearing was a complete ruse.
I had COVID right out of the gate in March of 2020. So
you might have gotten pretty sick then.
I did not.
Oh, interesting.
I did not. And that's what's interesting about this virus. I was a science reporter for 12 years, and I wrote a lot on viruses, HIV, hepatitis C. Mm-hmm. And I got COVID a couple of years ago. And I mean, it really walloped me. So either I had a false positive in 2020, or it's just a very different virus now that affected me. Well,
so a great book that's worth reading for those of you who would like to play catch up in a not too biased way is The Great Influenza by John Barry, which I read back in 2005. I curiously, through sheer coincidence, started reading about vaccines and immunology the summer of 2019 again. And it was triggered by a TED talk by a woman who talked about the polio vaccine, how the live one works better than the dead vaccine. And it didn't make sense to me. And so, but I had read books on how hard it is to make a safe vaccine. And this was not a biased book. This just talked about the mechanics of making vaccines. And they had created tons in the military and they couldn't use them because they were so lethal. And so, so one of the things in Barry's book they talk about is that if you take a pathogen, I think if I remember it, because again, it was 20 years ago, I read it, and you inject it serially through mice without a selection pressure. So without culling out the ones who survive, but simply just inject it, infect them, then take their blood, inject them. And so there's no filtering mechanism, that the pathogen loses its efficacy. I don't want to use, I'm not sure what's the right term, virulence. One of them's the ability to move and the other one's the ability to kill, it becomes less lethal just by going from organism to organism to organism. And they learned that back in 05 or something at the Rockefeller Foundation.
You were the associate editor of the Journal of Organic Chemistry. Have you ever seen a virus that's acted like this?
Well, we wouldn't do virus stuff in the Journal of Organic Chemistry. What's relevant about that role is that I can bring to bear the meaning of peer review. So oftentimes peer review gets thrown around either as a weapon to say what that guy says is baloney because it's not peer reviewed, or what the guy says is true because it's peer reviewed. Peer review, I would say on average, is some guy cutting a few hours out of his afternoon, reading the paper, figuring out whether he likes it or not, typing up a referee report to describe whether they like and should accept it, and then move on. And sometimes it gets passed over to a grad student, and the grad student does it, and then the PI might go through it to make sure the grad student didn't say something stupid in the referee report. But it is by no means a statement of fact, and is by no means a very, very detailed analysis, although sometimes it can be. And by no means is the absence of peer review mean something's wrong. And so no one should be baffled by peer review as a backstop to what they're saying. That's a huge mistake.
I've had a number of papers that were peer reviewed published, and I don't know, it was back in my former incarnation as an academic. You have had some difficulties with the academy.
Yes.
And I have seen the academy deteriorate over the years. What difficulties have you had with the academy?